Today I will tell you the story of how, the night before my son's wedding, his fiancée looked me in the eye and said I did not belong, how I chose silence instead of argument, and how 3 quiet calls would erase the fantasy she had built and leave 200 guests frozen in silence. This story is not about revenge shouted in anger. It is about justice spoken softly, yet landing louder than thunder. If you believe in grandma life stories, where dignity is tested and truth prevails, remember to like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Together we keep these stories alive. My name is Linda Carter. I am 62, a widow, and the founder of Carter Interiors. I built my company from nothing after my husband died, raising my son Ethan alone while working nights and weekends. I designed offices, homes, and hotels, one brick and beam at a time. My name is not carved in marble, but in trust, loyalty, and honest work. That Thursday evening, the St. Regis Hotel glittered with light. The rehearsal dinner was being prepared, waiters in white jackets carrying silver trays, laughter echoing through gilded halls. It should have been a night of joy, yet I had felt eyes on me all evening, cold, measuring, waiting. Finally, Madison, my son's fiancée, approached. She smiled for everyone else, but her grip on my arm was sharp when she whispered, "Come outside with me." She led me onto the balcony, where the city lights painted the horizon in gold and steel. Her smile disappeared the moment the doors shut. Her words cut like glass. "You don't belong at our wedding. Tomorrow is about important people, and you are not one of them." The chill in her tone was worse than winter air. She expected me to protest, perhaps plead for a place at the table. Instead, I stood still. I let silence do the work. In silence, arrogance often falters. My lips curved into the faintest smile, one that had unsettled contractors and competitors alike for decades. It was not the smile of surrender. It was the smile of someone who understood timing. She shifted her weight, unsettled by my calm. I did not answer. I did not give her the satisfaction of anger. I turned, walked back into the ballroom, and left her standing alone with her cruelty echoing in the night. Later, in my quiet Stamford kitchen, I poured myself a cup of coffee black as midnight. The house was still, the only sound the ticking clock on the wall. I looked at the photo of my late husband above the mantel and then at Ethan's graduation picture. My son was everything I had fought for. And yet tomorrow, I was told I did not belong. I sat at the table, hands steady, heart calm. Rage was a storm that destroyed without purpose. I did not need rage. I needed clarity. At 10:14 p.m., I picked up the phone and dialed the first number. David and Wen, general manager of a luxury hotel chain. Years ago, my company had saved his flagship property when a contractor abandoned the project, he remembered. At 10:27 p.m., I called Maria Lopez, whose family-owned floral company had once nearly collapsed. I had given her brother a job when no one else would, she remembered. At 10:41 p.m., I spoke to Father Whitmore of St. John's Parish, whose chapel I had restored after a fire, refusing any payment. He listened, quietly, and when I finished, he said, "I understand." 3 calls, simple words. No demands, no threats, just reminders of bonds built on trust. When I set the phone down, the silence was heavier, but not empty. It was full of the weight of years, the relationships, the sacrifices, the quiet respect I had earned while others boasted of refinement. Madison thought she had sealed my fate with 12 cruel words. In truth, she had only set her own collapse in motion. I leaned back in my chair, the smile returning. Some storms roar with thunder, others arrive in whispers. That night, my storm was already moving. It would be easy to imagine that Madison's words on the balcony were a single burst of cruelty, but the truth is far sharper. That night was not an accident. It was the culmination of weeks of small humiliations, each one sharper than the last. The first cut came 3 weeks earlier, when we sat at Ethan's apartment with the guest list spread across the table. I had written down the names of people who had walked through fire with me. My foreman, Mr. Ortiz, who stayed on job sites past midnight so I could make it to Ethan's school events. My neighbor, Mrs. Robinson, who watched Ethan when I worked 2 jobs. My crew, my friends, people who had poured their strength into the life I had built. Madison leaned over the list, her pen tapping. This will not do. These names, they do not fit the vision of our wedding. I frowned. These people are family in every way that matters. They carried me when no one else would. She smiled, that cold kind of smile that never touches the eyes. Linda, optics matter. This is not a barbecue. It is a Blake wedding. We cannot have construction workers sitting next to senators. I looked at Ethan, hoping for his voice. He shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. Mom, maybe we should keep it smaller. You know, family only. I stared at him. Family only. How quickly loyalty can be rewritten when someone whispers the word optics. I crossed out the names, each stroke heavier than the last, feeling a piece of myself sliced away. The second humiliation came the following week at a restaurant in Greenwich, where Charlotte Blake hosted a luncheon for both families. The Blakes were polished, every movement rehearsed, their laughter loud enough to prove they belonged. I wore a navy dress, simple but dignified. As I reached for my water, Charlotte's eyes swept over me like a judge considering a case she had already decided. "You have done well for yourself, Linda," she said, her tone lined with condescension. "But you must understand, old money has refinement. New money, well, it makes noise. It is never quite the same." The table went silent. Madison smirked, pretending to sip her wine. Ethan cleared his throat but said nothing. My fingers tightened around the glass until I thought it might crack. I wanted to answer, to remind Charlotte that her words cost nothing, while my life had been bought with sweat and sacrifice. Instead, I lifted my glass, drank, and swallowed every ounce of contempt they fed me. The third strike was more intimate, and somehow worse. Madison came to my house one afternoon, uninvited, holding a cream-colored envelope. She set it on the counter, her perfume filling the air. "This is the card from my family's tailor in Milan. We should schedule your fitting. First impressions matter. You'll be photographed next to people who represent centuries of legacy. We need you to look polished." I raised my eyebrows. "I already have a dress." Her smile sharpened. "Yes, but perhaps something more refined. You do not want Ethan embarrassed, do you?" "Embarrassed. My son, ashamed of me." She said it so casually, as if she were asking me to change shoes, not strip away my identity. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I kept my voice cool. "I have nothing to be embarrassed about." She leaned closer, her whisper cutting deeper. "Then prove it. Wear what belongs in our world." When she left, the envelope still sat on the counter. I looked at it for a long time before I dropped it straight into the trash. Dignity cannot be bought in Milan, no matter how fine the fabric. But the humiliations did not end there. At the rehearsal dinner planning session, Madison corrected me in front of the wedding planner. "Oh, don't mind her. She is not used to events of this caliber." Charlotte nodded, adding, "Linda, you should not worry about the details. We will handle what you cannot understand." Every word was another dismissal, another attempt to erase me piece by piece. Ethan noticed my silence. I know he did. He would squeeze my hand under the table, as if that could erase the sting of his fiancée's contempt or his future mother-in-law's disdain. But silence was no longer submission. Silence was my gathering storm. Each insult, each smirk, each word about optics or refinement piled higher. Madison believed she was securing her position by erasing me. Charlotte thought she was protecting her dynasty by belittling me. What they did not understand was that every cut they delivered was not removing me. It was sharpening me. By the time Madison stood on that balcony and told me I did not belong, she was not breaking me. She was finishing a sculpture she could not see. Her arrogance carved away any illusion I had left that this marriage was built on love. All that remained was truth. I walked away from those weeks humiliated, yes, but also awake. I had allowed them to chip at my dignity piece by piece, but humiliation, when it hardens, becomes something else. It becomes resolve. So when she finally said those words the night before the wedding, when she declared me unworthy, my silence was not surrender. It was the sound of a woman who had endured enough. And the storm that followed, well, that storm had been weeks in the making. When Madison's words sliced through the air on that balcony, I chose silence. No raised voice, no arguments, no pleas. I simply walked away. But silence does not always mean surrender. That night, silence meant calculation. I drove home through the empty streets of Stamford, the city lights fading behind me. My hands never trembled on the steering wheel. My mind was sharper than it had been in years. By the time I pulled into my driveway, humiliation had hardened into steel. Inside my quiet house, I switched on the kitchen light. The glow fell across the photo frames on the mantel. My late husband's smile looked back at me, frozen in time, the man who had carried bricks with his bare hands to build our first home. Beside him, Ethan's graduation photo, cap tilted, pride beaming in his eyes. I whispered into the silence, "They think I don't belong." I let the words hang there, testing their weight. They tasted bitter at first, but bitterness can be turned into fire if you are willing to hold it long enough. I was not crying. I was not broken. I was sharpening. I walked to the study, unlocked the tall oak cabinet, and pulled out the worn leather binder where I kept 3 decades of records. Contracts, thank you letters, photos of completed projects, even notes from clients who had once doubted me. I flipped through them slowly, the sound of paper sharp against the quiet. Each page was proof of something the Blakes could never buy. Respect earned, not inherited. I sat at the desk, pulled the phone closer, and dialed the first number. David Nguyen answered on the second ring. "Linda," he said, his voice warm, familiar. "It's been too long. How are you?" I didn't waste time. "David, tomorrow you'll hear about a wedding at St. Regis. Madison Blake and my son. I need you to remember something. 5 years ago, when your flagship hotel was drowning in delays, who finished it ahead of schedule?" His laugh was short, knowing. "Carter Interiors, you saved me millions." I never asked for favors, but tonight I am asking. If anyone calls you tomorrow, if anyone leans on you about bookings or hospitality for the Blake wedding, you remember who stood by you when no one else would. Silence on the line, then his voice steady. "Linda, I don't forget debts. Whatever storm you are walking into, I'll stand with you." I hung up and immediately dialed the second number. Maria Lopez picked up, her voice hurried as always. "Maria," I said, "do you remember the day your brother came to me after his conviction? Everyone turned him away, but I gave him a chance." Her voice cracked with memory. "You gave him work when no one else trusted him. He has a family now, Linda. He has a life." "Then you know why I'm calling. The Blakes don't want me at that wedding. They've cut me piece by piece, erased my name from lists, from tables, from respect. Tomorrow, if their people come asking for flowers, for arrangements, for favors, you remember me, not them." Maria's tone hardened. "I owe you more than flowers. You won't be alone in this." I thanked her, but my face remained cold. Gratitude was not the point tonight. Loyalty was. The third call came last. I scrolled to Father Whitmore's number and pressed dial. He answered with his usual calm. "Linda, it's late. Is everything all right?" "No," I said, my voice level, almost too steady. "But it will be. Do you remember the fire at St. John's? Do you remember who restored your chapel, who refused payment because some debts are owed to God alone?" His breath caught. "I remember every nail. You rebuilt faith when we had none." "Then listen carefully. Tomorrow, if the Blakes call asking for favors, asking to use your parish halls or sanctuaries, you tell them the truth. Tell them the woman they erased still stands." His voice softened with gravity. "Linda, I will not forget what you did for us. Whatever comes, I am with you." I ended the call. 3 voices, 3 reminders, 3 anchors in a sea where the Blakes thought they controlled the tide. I sat back, the clock ticking toward midnight. My hands folded calmly on the desk. Madison believed her cruelty had buried me. She did not realize that cruelty had lit a signal fire. In 30 years, I had built more than interiors. I had built trust. And trust, when called upon, does not hesitate. I walked to the mirror in the hall. My reflection stared back, lines of age carved deep, but behind them something stronger glowed. I did not see weakness. I saw clarity. The kind of clarity that makes enemies uneasy because it does not shout. It waits. I whispered to my reflection, "Tomorrow is not theirs. Tomorrow is mine." When I turned off the lights and went upstairs, the house was silent again. But it was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a storm gathering strength. A mother scorned, but not broken. A woman dismissed, but not erased. They thought I did not belong. They would learn how dangerous a silent mother can be. The morning of the wedding began with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the sharp silence before an explosion. At 6:30, I poured my coffee and waited. I had made 3 calls the night before. Now it was time to see if loyalty still meant something in a world where people like Charlotte Blake believed only power counted. By 8, the first cracks appeared. I was not in their suite, but word traveled quickly, carried by whispers. Madison had woken up to frantic phone calls from her planner. St. Regis had canceled the reservation. No ballroom, no catered breakfast, no luxury staff lining the hall with trays of champagne. The reason was simple: unexpected internal conflict. But I knew better. David had remembered who had saved him when no one else did. Madison's voice echoed through the hotel hallway, high-pitched and desperate. "What do you mean canceled? This is the Blake wedding. You cannot just—" She slammed the phone shut, mascara streaking before the makeup artist could even begin. By 9, the second blow landed. The floral trucks that had been scheduled to arrive never showed. Rows of white orchids, peonies, roses, all gone. Madison clutched her phone, redialing Maria's company again and again. Each time she was met with the same calm answer. "We regret to inform you, we will not be providing arrangements for today's event." I pictured her in that hotel suite, surrounded by half-packed boxes of decorations, staring at empty tables. Her dream wedding was starting to look like a hollow stage. Charlotte's fury was volcanic. She stormed into the room, her heels hitting the marble like gunfire. "Someone is sabotaging us," she hissed, her jaw tight enough to crack. She turned on Ethan, her finger stabbing the air. "Check the contracts. Call your mother's contacts. This reeks of interference." Ethan froze, caught between the 2 women pulling him apart. He stammered, why would anyone—" Charlotte cut him off. "Because your mother has always been a thorn. She doesn't fit. And now, conveniently, every piece of this wedding collapses the morning after she leaves the hotel? Do you really think this is coincidence?" I can imagine his face then, torn, confused, but still unwilling to believe. Love blinds faster than truth can open the eyes. By 10, the 3rd strike came, St. John's, the church reserved for the ceremony, sent their official notice. "Due to scheduling conflicts, we regret we cannot host the Blake Carter wedding today." A single sheet of paper, signed by Father Whitmore himself, delivered to their suite. Madison screamed when she read it, crumpling it in her fist and throwing it against the wall. Her voice cracked into sobs. "This was supposed to be perfect. I planned everything, months of work. How can it all vanish in one morning?" Charlotte did not cry. She never cried. Her anger was ice. She turned to Ethan again. "Open your eyes. This is not sabotage. This is war, and your mother is the only person with motive strong enough to wage it." Ethan shook his head. "Mom wouldn't—" His words faltered, even as he tried to defend me. "Wouldn't she?" Charlotte snapped. "She despises us. She resents everything we stand for. Do you really think her silence last night was weakness? It was calculation. Mark my words, Ethan, she is behind this." I was not there to see his expression, but I know my son. He would have looked down, caught between love for a woman who sneered at me and loyalty to the mother who had carried him through storms. Confusion was the weapon they tried to plant in him, but doubt has a way of growing roots. By noon, panic had fully taken hold. The planner paced the suite, making frantic phone calls to second-rate vendors, begging for last-minute replacements. Madison sobbed into Charlotte's shoulder, her perfect curls damp with tears. Ethan moved like a ghost, rushing from one phone to another, speaking to managers, to priests, to anyone who might salvage the day. His voice cracked with desperation. The once flawless image of the Blake wedding had shattered into chaos. Empty vases sat in corners, chairs were stacked against walls, menus were thrown out. The grandeur they had promised their guests was dissolving minute by minute. And all the while, I sat in my kitchen, the sunlight warming the counter, my coffee cooling beside me. I did not pace, I did not worry. I waited. Because storms do not need thunder to be effective. Sometimes they arrive quietly, dismantling everything brick by brick. From their perspective, it must have felt like fate turning cruel. But fate had nothing to do with it. Loyalty had, respect had. The choices I made decades ago, choosing fairness, choosing kindness, choosing to stand by people when they were discarded, those choices were returning to me now as shields and swords. By 1 o'clock, Charlotte made her final stand. We cannot cancel. Too many people have flown in. We will move it to the estate. We still have the Blake name, the Blake grounds. We will make it work. Madison's tear-streaked face lifted with fragile hope. Ethan nodded, though his shoulders sagged under the weight of compromise. They believed shifting the wedding to their mansion would save them. But I knew better. They had already lost. That morning proved what Madison refused to believe. The world she clung to, the illusion of control and legacy, was built on fragile glass. One push, and it cracked. As the sun rose higher, guests began to arrive at St. Regis, only to be turned away. Some whispered about disaster, others about scandal. And as rumors spread like wildfire, one question lingered in the minds of those who knew me, who had watched the Blakes dismiss me, humiliate me, erase me. Could Linda Carter, the mother they said did not belong, have been the hand behind the chaos? I never answered that question out loud. I did not need to. The silence of that morning spoke louder than any confession ever could. By early afternoon, the decision had been made. There was no St. Regis, no floral hall, no grand church to cover the cracks. The Blakes had only one card left to play, and Charlotte pulled it with clenched teeth. "We move it to the estate," she ordered, her voice cutting through the panic. "The Blake mansion can hold them. 200 guests will not walk away. We will not give them the satisfaction of seeing us broken." So it was set. Cars began rerouting, invitations updated by frantic calls, and the guests, already murmuring about disaster, were told to head for the sprawling Blake estate. That house had been a symbol for decades. White stone columns, manicured hedges, fountains that sang even in winter. Now, it would serve as a battlefield. By 3 o'clock, I arrived. I had been given no formal word, but whispers move fast in these circles. The mansion gates opened to a stream of black cars. Drivers held doors, and men in tailored suits stepped out alongside women balancing on thin heels. 200 people dressed in silk and pearls filed inside with eyes already wide. The air was not festive. It was tense. I walked slowly across the gravel path, my simple dress brushing against the breeze. No grand jewelry, no loud colors, just quiet strength. Heads turned, some guests whispered, others avoided my gaze altogether. The message was clear. I was not supposed to be here, but I was. And every step I took across those marble floors declared it. Inside, the ballroom of the mansion had been transformed in haste. White chairs stood crooked in rows, gaps where flowers should have been. The chandelier burned too bright, as if trying to distract from the emptiness. Waiters hurried with trays that looked half-prepared. What should have been a display of luxury looked instead like a shell of desperation. I found my place near the back. From there I could see everything. Madison pacing near the staircase, tears ruining the powder on her face. Charlotte beside her, whispering fiercely, forcing composure onto her daughter with each bite of her words. Ethan moved quickly from guest to guest, apologizing, making excuses. His face was pale, his tie loosened. Guests whispered, their voices sharp in the heavy air. "Why here? Why so sudden?" one asked. "I thought St. Regis was confirmed," another muttered. "This feels wrong." Every murmur carved deeper into Madison's pride. At 4, the ceremony was announced. A hush fell, but it was not reverence. It was tension, heavy and suffocating. 200 pairs of eyes watched as Madison descended the staircase, her gown shimmering, her smile forced like a mask about to crack. She clutched the railing tighter than she clutched her bouquet. Charlotte straightened, her chin lifted as if daring anyone to notice the disaster. She whispered loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Appearances must be maintained." The words tasted like iron. Ethan stood waiting at the makeshift altar, his shoulders sagging under invisible weight. His eyes found mine briefly. For a moment, something flickered. Doubt, or maybe shame. I did not flinch. I simply returned his gaze with calm certainty. As Madison reached the altar, whispers rippled through the crowd. "It feels cursed," someone murmured. "Too many coincidences," another replied, and then Charlotte's words sliced into the air. "Someone is sabotaging us." She had not meant to say it so loudly, but her voice carried. Heads turned. People glanced at me, then back at the bride and groom. I felt the eyes, the weight of suspicion pressing against my back. I did not move. I did not deny. I let them wonder. Madison's lips trembled as she leaned toward Ethan. "This was supposed to be perfect," she hissed through clenched teeth. "Look at it. Half the guests don't even believe in us anymore. I should never have let her come." Charlotte's hand gripped Madison's arm, hard enough to leave marks. "Hold yourself together. This family will not be humiliated further." But the truth was, humiliation had already arrived. It sat in every crooked chair, every empty vase, every whisper that spread like wildfire. From my seat, I felt the storm pressing closer. The Blakes believed relocating the wedding would salvage their pride. Instead, it only magnified their weakness. Every guest could see it now, and 200 witnesses meant no one could rewrite this story later. When the officiant began to speak, his voice echoed against the marble walls, but it could not drown out the unease. This was not a celebration. This was a performance unraveling, thread by thread. I folded my hands in my lap, my face calm, my eyes sharp. They thought forcing the wedding into their fortress would protect them. What they did not understand was that fortresses fall not from the outside, but from the cracks within. The estate, with all its grandeur, had become something else entirely. Not a home, not a stage, but a courtroom. And I was ready to let the evidence speak for itself. When the ceremony shifted to the Blake estate, the atmosphere was already poisoned. Whispers ran like currents under the marble arches. 200 guests filled the room, but it felt less like a celebration and more like a gathering before a verdict. I entered quietly, no fanfare, no announcement. Yet every eye turned as though the air itself had shifted. I wore no jewels, no embroidered silk, no desperate attempt to impress. My dress was black crepe, simple in its lines but sharp in its presence. A pearl pin held my collar closed, and my hair was pulled back neatly. The kind of attire people overlook until they notice how it commands silence. My shoes echoed across the polished floor, measured, deliberate, final. I took my seat near the center. Not the back, not hidden, not exiled. A chair left vacant by chance became mine by choice. The murmurs quieted as I sat. I crossed one leg over the other, folded my hands, and lifted my chin. I did not seek permission. I did not ask for acceptance. I belonged because I decided to. Across the room, Madison faltered. Her steps caught as she saw me, her smile stiffening before it broke. Charlotte leaned close to her daughter, whispering sharply, but her eyes betrayed unease. The cracks in their composure widened the moment I became visible. Ethan looked at me once, only once, but it was enough. A flash of recognition, of relief, quickly smothered by the weight of obligation. He straightened his tie, his jaw tense. I held his gaze long enough to let him know I was not here to beg. I was here to witness. The officiant cleared his throat, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. "We are gathered today." His words stretched hollow, fighting against the tension that pulsed through the room. My silence pressed harder than any speech. It was not what I said that unsettled them. It was what I might say. Charlotte shifted in her seat, eyes darting between me and the guests. Her smile widened unnaturally, as if sheer force could hold the illusion together. She leaned into Madison. "Ignore her. She thrives on spectacle. Do not give her what she wants." But they misunderstood me. I was not performing. I was dismantling. Slowly, silently, with nothing but presence. Guests began to whisper again, more openly this time. "She came. I thought she had been told not to. Look how calm she is." Each word carried weight, adding fuel to suspicion. And suspicion is a poison that spreads quickly. Madison's hand trembled as she clutched her bouquet. She whispered through clenched teeth, loud enough for those near her to hear. "Why is she here? She should not even be allowed inside." Her voice cracked on the last word, and her mother's hand tightened over hers. "Hold yourself together," Charlotte ordered. But the command rang thin. From my seat, I watched their unraveling. Every twitch, every whisper, every flicker of panic. The grand chandelier above could not draw the attention away. The guests were no longer focused on the vows. They were focused on me, the woman who had been told she did not belong, now sitting at the heart of their spectacle, unshaken. I said nothing. That was the point. Silence, when wielded with precision, is more powerful than accusation. It leaves room for imagination, for dread, for guilt to rot from the inside. My stillness was a mirror, forcing them to see themselves without the mask of grandeur. The officiant stumbled over his words, sensing the fracture in the room. His script became shaky, his tone uncertain. Madison's eyes darted to me again and again, until her mask cracked. Her smile faltered in front of 200 witnesses. Charlotte's nails dug into her daughter's hand, her jaw set so tight I could see the muscles twitch. I tilted my head slightly, allowing the faintest trace of a smile to touch my lips. Not kindness, not forgiveness, certainty. The kind of certainty that tells the world a storm has already begun. I heard one guest behind me whisper, "She knows something." Another replied, "This doesn't feel like a wedding. It feels like a reckoning." I kept my posture straight, my hands steady. My silence weighed on them more than any words could. Madison shifted her feet, nearly stumbling as she turned to face Ethan. Her whisper was sharp. "She is ruining everything." And Ethan, though quiet, could not hide the flicker of doubt in his eyes. This was not chaos yet. Chaos would come later. This was pressure. Pressure that made every glass tremble on the tables, every guest uneasy in their seats, every word of the officiant feel forced. My silence was not absence. It was the blade hovering above, unseen but undeniable. They had told me I did not belong. But in that moment, in that room, it was they who did not belong. They did not belong to the truth, to loyalty, to the respect of 200 witnesses who could see the cracks forming. I sat still. I did not move. I did not need to. My silence was already louder than thunder. And Madison knew it. Charlotte knew it. Even Ethan, though he could not yet admit it, knew it. The battle had begun, not with shouting, not with spectacle, but with the kind of silence that strips illusions bare. The officiant raised his hand, ready to begin the vows. His voice had barely found its rhythm when I stood. Chairs creaked as heads turned in unison. The silence in that grand hall grew thick enough to suffocate. I did not raise my voice. I didn't need to. Calm words strike harder when truth stands behind them. "Before this ceremony continues," I said, my gaze sweeping the crowd, "the guests deserve to know something." A ripple of shock moved through the room. Charlotte stiffened instantly, her jaw tight. Madison's eyes darted like a trapped animal. Ethan froze at the altar, his shoulders rigid, his breath shallow. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder, slim but heavy with consequence. From it, I slid a single sheet of paper, an email printed in black and white. No theatrics, no flourish, just plain evidence. I held it steady, letting the room see it existed before I spoke. "This," I said evenly, "is an email thread dated last month. Madison Blake used Ethan Carter's personal credit card, without his knowledge, to pay off her father's gambling debts in Atlantic City." The words detonated like dynamite in silence. Gasps erupted, whispers cascading down the rows of guests. 200 people leaned forward, the weight of disbelief colliding with the sting of recognition. Madison staggered back a step, color draining from her face. "That's a lie," she hissed, her voice cracking, trembling on the edge of collapse. I did not flinch. "The receipts are attached. $15,000 withdrawn from Ethan's account, routed directly to cover John Blake's losses. Atlantic City casinos do not lie. They log every cent. This isn't hearsay. This is fact." I turned to Ethan then. I did not look at Madison or Charlotte anymore. "Did you authorize this?" My voice carried, sharp enough that no one could miss the question. Ethan's mouth opened, but no sound came. He glanced at Madison, his eyes pleading for an explanation she could not provide. The silence between them screamed louder than her denial. Guests began murmuring louder, some shaking their heads in disgust. "$15,000? Someone whispered. "On the groom's card?" Another hissed. "Imagine starting a marriage with theft." Charlotte tried to seize control. She rose, her posture commanding, her tone like a gavel. "This is irrelevant. Families support each other. If funds moved, it was for the good of all. This is a wedding, not a courtroom." I faced her calmly. "Then let the guests decide if they wish to witness vows built on deceit. Because a wedding without truth is not a union, it's a transaction." The room stirred again, stronger this time. My words had cracked the dam, and whispers flooded every corner. Madison shook her head violently, tears streaking through her makeup. She grabbed Ethan's hand desperately. "She's twisting this. She's jealous. She wants to ruin us." Ethan looked down at her, confusion etched across his face. "Madison, is it true?" His voice was broken, stripped raw. She clutched his arm tighter. "Of course not. She forged it. She hates me. Don't you see? She's been against us from the beginning." I slid the second page forward, my hand steady. "This is the confirmation email from the casino itself, thanking Mrs. Madison Blake for resolving the balance. No forgery, just your words, just your choices." Gasps rose again, sharper, angrier. Guests craned their necks, some even leaning into the aisle for a better look. The illusion of refinement Madison clung to was dissolving in front of 200 witnesses. Ethan's face collapsed into silence. He dropped her hand, his shoulders slumping under the truth. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His retreat spoke louder than words. Madison's scream tore through the hall, desperate and raw. "You don't understand. My father needed help. We had no choice." Charlotte tried to shield her daughter, her hand gripping Madison's arm. "Enough. You owe no explanation. This family does what is necessary." But the crowd was no longer on their side. Whispers sharpened into judgments. Stealing before the vows? Dragging his family into debt? This is shameful. I stepped back, folding the paper neatly, not gloating, not triumphant. My face was calm, my voice still measured. Truth deserves light. If this ceremony continues, it will continue under the weight of that truth. But no guest here can say they were deceived into silence. The officiant stood frozen, clutching his book, his lips pressed tight as if waiting for direction. He looked at Ethan, then at Madison, then finally at me. The ceremony was broken. The facade was shattered. Charlotte glared at me, her eyes burning with hatred. Madison sobbed, her mascara streaking down her cheeks, clutching her dress as if it could shield her. Ethan remained stone still, his world crumbling at his feet. And I sat back down, my hands folded neatly, my eyes forward. I had not raised my voice. I had not shouted, but I had cut deeper than any scream ever could. The first piece of truth had been laid bare, and it was only the beginning. The room was still vibrating with the first revelation when I rose again. Gasps whispered across the crowd. They knew I was not finished. My steps were slow, deliberate, each heel striking the marble like a countdown. Madison clutched her bouquet tighter, mascara running, but this time the real weight of dread shifted onto Charlotte. She kept her chin high, but her eyes betrayed calculation. She was already preparing a defense. I held another folder in my hands, thinner than the first, but far more poisonous. The email was not the only truth buried under this wedding, I said, my voice carrying over 200 silent guests. There is another document, one that explains why this union mattered more to the Blakes than vows or love. I opened the folder and unfolded the papers with steady hands. The sound of crisp paper cutting through silence made the crowd lean forward. This is a draft agreement, I continued, prepared by Blake Law Group, authored under Charlotte Blake's oversight. It states, clearly in black ink, that upon marriage, Ethan Carter would transfer 40% ownership of Carter Interiors into the Blake Family Trust. Not as a partnership, not as collaboration, but as an acquisition disguised as matrimony. The words landed heavy, and the reaction was immediate. Gasps, outrage, guests muttering curses under their breath. Some shook their heads violently, others glared openly at Charlotte. Ethan's face went white. He stepped forward, snatching the paper from my hand. His eyes scanned the lines, his lips moving soundlessly as he read. I watched his shoulders tense, his breath quicken, his jaw clench. Then his voice broke into the silence. 40% of my company? His voice cracked with disbelief. Mom, this can't be real. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truth was in his hands. Madison lunged toward him, her voice desperate, high-pitched. It's just a draft, Ethan. Nothing was final. My mother was protecting us, securing our future. Don't let her twist this. Charlotte cut her off, standing with icy composure. Stop begging, Madison. Her voice was cold steel. She turned to Ethan, addressing him as though the entire audience didn't exist. Yes, the contract is real. Yes, I drafted it. And yes, I intended to protect my family's legacy. Do you think love alone feeds empires? Do you think marriage is only about emotion? Families must sacrifice for survival. Her words were not shouted. They were deliberate, carved from the same marble she stood upon. The crowd recoiled at her calm cruelty. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering harsh judgments. Sacrifice? She calls it sacrifice? That's theft, not survival. Ethan shook his head violently, the paper trembling in his hands. You wanted me to hand over nearly half of Carter Interiors, the company my mother built from nothing, the company she bled for, and you expected me to sign it away under the disguise of marriage? Charlotte's eyes never wavered. You would have gained more than you lost. The Blake name, the Blake influence. Doors your mother could never open, no matter how many walls she painted or floors she polished. Sacrifice of 40% to gain 100% legitimacy. The venom in her logic silenced even the officiant, who clutched his book tightly, unsure if he should step forward or retreat. I stepped closer, my voice steady, each word aimed like a blade. Legitimacy built on deception is not legitimacy. It is theft with polish. You call it survival. I call it exploitation. And you expected my son to become another line item in your firm's portfolio. Madison's tears now ran unchecked, streaking her face, but she still tried to salvage ground. Ethan, listen to me. It was only a draft. We never signed it. Nothing mattered except us. Her words dissolved under the weight of Ethan's silence. His chest rose and fell, his hands shaking as the paper crumpled slightly between his fingers. He looked up, his eyes raw. All this time, you weren't marrying me, you were marrying my company. The hall erupted into murmurs. One guest spoke louder than the rest, his disgust unfiltered. Shameful, to use marriage as a transaction. Another voice added, 40% of her life's work. Just stolen? Charlotte lifted her chin higher, her voice slicing through the outrage. Do not speak of theft. Speak of strategy. Families that survive are families that take what must be taken. Weakness has no place in legacy. Her declaration froze the hall. The sheer audacity of her logic, so unapologetic, so naked, sent shivers through the crowd. Some gasped in horror, others simply shook their heads, unable to believe what they had heard. I stepped back slowly, letting her words echo. I had not needed to frame her as the villain. She had crowned herself. Ethan's voice came low, almost trembling. You looked me in the eye every day. You let me believe this was love. And all the while, you were planning to cut apart the only thing my mother ever built. Madison's sobs turned desperate, but Charlotte silenced her with a sharp glare. Love does not build dynasties, Ethan. Sacrifice does. Your mother will fade, Carter Interiors will fade, but the Blake name will endure. That is all that matters. The air snapped with outrage. Guests shook their heads, some even rising to their feet. 200 witnesses, caught between horror and fascination, leaned in to watch a dynasty expose its own rot. And I, silent once again, folded my hands. My point had been proven without needing another word. The second blow had landed. Not by my mouth, but by Charlotte Blake's own ruthless confession. The first crack had been Madison's theft. The second was Charlotte's greed. And before the night ended, both would collapse under the weight of truth. The room had turned into a crucible. The heat of 200 stares pressed down on Ethan as he stood with the crumpled contract in his hands. His knuckles were white, his shoulders trembling under the weight of betrayal. The silence was so tight you could hear his uneven breaths echoing in the vast hall. I didn't move closer, didn't plead with him. I simply stood, letting him see every word for himself. This was not a moment for a mother's persuasion. It was a moment for truth to stand on its own. Ethan looked at me with eyes that were bloodshot, wounded, and searching. Mom, tell me this isn't real. His voice cracked, but there was no answer I needed to give. The papers in his hands screamed louder than I ever could. Madison stumbled toward him, tears streaking her cheeks, her voice a rapid-fire plea. Ethan, you can't believe this. It's just paper. It's meaningless. We never signed anything. I love you, and that's what matters. But her words fell hollow in the heavy air. Ethan lifted the pages again, scanning them over and over as if they might magically rearrange into something less damning. His lips moved soundlessly, tracing the clauses, the numbers, the clear demand for 40% ownership. I could see his hands trembling harder, as though the contract itself burned him. And I thought of the nights I had worked by lamplight, of the days when his father and I skipped meals so Ethan could have books for school. Now he stood between two worlds, the family that built him and the woman who demanded he erase it. Charlotte's voice sliced through the silence, deliberate and merciless. Ethan, you must understand. This is not betrayal. This is survival. The Carters have strength, but the Blakes have permanence. Combine them, and both endure. Refuse, and everything your mother built will crumble when she's gone. Gasps rippled across the hall. Her words weren't coded in apology. They were stripped bare, weaponized with logic. Ethan's chest heaved. He turned toward her, the pain in his eyes now sharpened with fury. You call that survival? You call stealing from my mother a strategy? You wanted to take what she spent her life building and dress it up as sacrifice. Charlotte didn't blink. Yes, because that is what powerful families do. We take, we adapt, and we endure. The crowd erupted in whispers, anger boiling beneath every breath. I stayed silent. My silence wasn't weakness. It was a mirror. Ethan had to see it all, unfiltered, with no hand guiding his eyes. Madison grabbed his arm, desperate now. Ethan, please, don't throw us away. Don't throw me away because of a draft. I am not my mother. I chose you, not Carter Interiors. I chose us. Her tears fell onto his sleeve, but he didn't wipe them. His face twisted, torn between rage and grief. His voice rose, loud enough to silence the murmurs. You knew, Madison. You knew this was being written. You sat at the same table while she put numbers on my family's name, and you said nothing. Madison shook her head violently. I thought it was just precaution. I didn't think she'd go through with it. I swear I didn't." Ethan's voice cracked like thunder. "And you didn't tell me. You let me stand here believing this was about love, about building something together. But all along, it was about dismantling what my mother gave her entire life to protect." The guests sat frozen, their gazes bouncing from son to mother, from fiancée to matriarch. Every eye was wide, every jaw clenched. They weren't just spectators. They were witnesses to a man being forced to choose between love and loyalty. Charlotte leaned in, her voice a low hiss that still carried through the hall. "Think carefully, Ethan. You can cling to your mother's pride, or you can embrace a future with us. But you cannot have both." The cruelty in her words tightened every muscle in the room. My son closed his eyes for a long moment, his jaw trembling. His silence felt endless, the kind of silence that makes your chest ache. I didn't move. I didn't speak. He needed to decide for himself who he was. Finally, he opened his eyes, and the fury there startled even me. "You made one mistake," he said, his voice steady now. "You thought I would trade my mother's sacrifice for your family's greed. You thought I was weak enough to sell her legacy for a last name that means nothing to me." The crowd exhaled as if a storm had broken. Madison collapsed into tears, Charlotte's face hardened into stone. Ethan turned to me, his voice lower but resolute. "Mom, I see it now. I see all of it." I gave him nothing more than a nod, not triumph, not relief, just the quiet strength of a mother who had waited too long for this moment. 200 people sat in silence, every breath held. They had come for a wedding. What they got was a trial. And my son, my Ethan, had just chosen his side. The silence was unbearable. It clung to the room like a heavy fog, pressing on every chest. 200 guests leaned forward, some clutching their programs, some holding their breath, all waiting for Ethan's next move. His hands were still trembling as he stared at the contract, then at Madison, then finally at me. His lips parted, but no words came. Instead, he looked down at his hand. The gold band, still gleaming from last night's rehearsal dinner, caught the light of the chandelier. I saw his fingers twitch, hesitant, then close around it. For a moment, I thought he would hold it tighter, cling to the illusion that had carried him this far. But then, with a sharp inhale, he pulled it free. The sound it made when he set it down was almost nothing, just a soft metallic tap against the polished oak table beside the altar. Yet in that moment, it sounded like a hammer striking steel, like a verdict being delivered. The room gasped as one. 200 bodies jolted upright. Chairs creaked. Fans froze mid-wave. The tap of that ring carried more force than any shout could have. It was the sound of something breaking, something final. Madison let out a cry so raw it tore through the air. "No!" Her voice cracked, high and desperate. She lunged toward Ethan, clutching at his arm, tears streaming down her face. "You don't mean that. You can't do this to me. Not here, not now." But Ethan's face was stone. He shook her hand off, his chest heaving, his jaw set. "I meant every second of it," he said, his voice low but steady, cutting through the chaos. "I cannot build a life on betrayal. Not yours, not your mother's." Madison staggered back, her sobs echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Her bouquet slipped from her hands, crashing onto the marble floor in a scatter of roses and lilies. The petals spread like blood across white stone, and the crowd gasped again, the symbolism not lost on anyone. Charlotte rose from her seat, her knuckles white, her fists clenched so tight they shook. Her lips were a thin, bloodless line. "Ethan," she spat, her voice vibrating with fury, "you are making a grave mistake. Do you think you can humiliate this family, in this house, and walk away unscathed?" But Ethan didn't flinch. He stood taller, his shoulders squaring for the first time that day. "This isn't humiliation, Charlotte. This is truth. You tried to buy me with your name and strip away my mother's life's work. You tried to chain me with contracts and lies. But today, I choose freedom." The guests broke into murmurs, their whispers like wildfire spreading through the hall. He walked away from her. He sided with his mother. "Can you believe it?" Charlotte snapped her gaze to me, her voice dripping venom. "You orchestrated this. You think this is victory? You have no idea what you've unleashed." I met her stare, calm and unwavering. "No, Charlotte, this isn't my victory. This is Ethan's choice, and that terrifies you more than anything I could ever do." Madison fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Her hair clung to her damp cheeks, her voice a broken mantra. "Ethan, please, don't leave me. Don't abandon everything we dreamed." But Ethan didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the small, gleaming band lying abandoned on the table. That ring, once a promise, now lay like evidence of a crime that would never be erased. The officiant shifted nervously, his hand trembling on his book. He had seen ceremonies end awkwardly, but never shattered like this. His lips pressed tight. He said nothing, waiting for someone to tell him what came next. The crowd remained frozen. Some guests looked away, unable to bear Madison's collapse. Others watched with grim fascination, as though they were witnessing history. Every breath in the room seemed to be drawn in unison, every eye locked on the tiny circle of gold. Charlotte finally hissed, "Get up, Madison. Stop crying like a child." But her command only made Madison's sobs louder, more pitiful. The contrast between the mother's coldness and the daughter's desperation cut through every guest like a knife. Ethan turned at last, his eyes locking with mine. For a brief second, the boy I had raised, the boy who once fell asleep on blueprints at my drafting table, the boy I carried through hospital nights, looked at me with the raw honesty of a man. "Mom," he said, voice thick but resolute, "thank you for showing me." I didn't smile. I didn't reach for him. I only gave a slight nod, the kind of nod that said, "You finally see what I've always known." The ring still glinted on the table, untouched. 200 guests sat in absolute silence, the weight of his decision hanging in the air like a storm about to break. And though no one dared to say it aloud, everyone knew this wedding was over. The hall was already quaking with shock, but Charlotte Blake did not crumble. She rose from her chair with an elegance sharpened into a weapon, her emerald dress sweeping like armor. The muscles in her jaw were tight, but her voice carried across the room with perfect clarity, honed from decades of courtroom battles. "Linda," she said, her tone smooth as silk and just as cutting, "you do not understand. This is how the world works. Old money preserves legacies. New money is just noise that fades when the winds change." The words stung, not just at me, but at everyone in the room who had ever clawed their way from nothing. I saw shoulders stiffen among the guests, faces harden with offense. Still, I remained still, letting her bear her contempt in full daylight. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You built Carter Interiors with grit and sweat. Admirable, perhaps, but buildings age, businesses shift, trends collapse. Families like mine, we endure. 4 generations of Blake blood have sat at the center of this county's power. Judges, senators, industrialists, that is permanence. That is what Ethan was being offered. And you," she tilted her head, almost pitying, "you've confused raising a son with raising an heir." Gasps scattered through the hall. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others leaned forward, entranced by the venom of her performance. I lifted my chin, my voice even and unshaken. "I raised a son, not a merger." The sentence landed like a gavel strike. A ripple of murmurs rushed across the room. 200 witnesses felt the weight of those words, simple yet absolute. Charlotte's lips pressed into a thin smile, but her eyes burned with rage. And what has that given him? Sentiment? Morality? These things don't keep empires alive. Ethan would have had influence beyond anything you could imagine. He would have sat at tables your kind only builds chairs for. My kind. The phrase sliced deeper than she intended, and the crowd felt it. More murmurs rose, angry, indignant. A contractor's son, reduced to furniture in her metaphor. Ethan's voice cracked through the tension, raw with disbelief. "Mother, stop!" He rarely raised his voice, but now it cut sharper than any of mine. "You talk about me as if I'm a pawn, as if my life is only a piece on your board. But I am not your merger. I am not your acquisition." Charlotte turned to him with a chilling calm. "Ethan, one day you will see I was right. Love fades. Sentiment dies. Only legacy survives." I stepped forward, my gaze locked on hers. Legacy is not built by contracts or blackmail. Legacy is built by the lives we touch, the communities we serve, the children we raise with integrity. You speak of permanence, but when history remembers this day, it will not speak of the Blakes' endurance. It will speak of their greed. The audience shifted like a jury swaying in unison. A guest whispered loudly enough for the whole front row to hear. "She's right. Greed never lasts." Charlotte's composure cracked for the first time. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the table, but she still pressed forward. "You think this room is your victory? These 200 people are nothing. They gossip, they sneer, but tomorrow they'll still attend our galas and call us for donations. Power bends perception, Linda. Always has, always will." I let her words hang in the air, then answered softly, so quietly that every guest leaned in to hear. "If power were enough, you wouldn't need to steal from my son to keep it alive." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Charlotte inhaled sharply, her mask slipping just enough to reveal the fury beneath. "You are beneath me!" she spat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. And yet here we stand, side by side, judged by every eye in this room. Which of us looks smaller now? The hall erupted into hushed gasps, the weight of her arrogance collapsing under its own mass. 200 witnesses saw it for what it was. Not power, not survival, but desperation dressed in jewels. Ethan's hands were still trembling, but he lifted the ring from the table and held it up like evidence. "This was supposed to mean love, but you turned it into a contract, and I won't wear chains disguised as gold." The audience murmured again, louder this time, their collective outrage thick and undeniable. It was no longer just my voice against hers. It was the judgment of a community watching a dynasty expose its own rot. Charlotte's eyes darted across the crowd, realizing for the first time that the tide had turned against her. But she straightened, refusing to bow, her words defiant until the end. "You think today is the end of us? No. Today is merely the end of your illusions. The Blakes will rise again. We always do." I answered without hesitation. "Rise if you can, but not on my son's back, not on my husband's legacy, not on my family's blood." The audience sat rapt, as though a courtroom trial had unfolded before their very eyes, and in that moment it was clear. The verdict had already been cast. The hall had become a furnace of whispers. What began as low murmurs now rolled like waves, crashing against the chandeliers and echoing in every corner of the Blake estate. 200 guests dressed in silks and tuxedos shifted uneasily in their chairs. Some leaned to each other, hands cupped over mouths, voices sharp with judgment. Others didn't bother to hide their disgust. I watched as one older couple stood abruptly, their chairs scraping across the polished marble. Without a word, they walked toward the doors, their exit deliberate, their silence louder than any condemnation. Their departure was the first crack, and soon others followed. A woman in pearls shook her head, muttering, "Shameful, absolutely shameful," before gathering her things and leaving. Each step toward the exit was a nail hammered into Madison's illusions of grandeur. She stood in the center aisle, her mascara smeared, her hands trembling as she tried to hold on to what was already slipping through her fingers. "Please," she whimpered, her voice too thin to command anyone's pity. "Please don't look at me like that." But they did. Every gaze that fell on her was merciless. Some eyes held pity, but most dripped with disdain. The Blake charm had evaporated, leaving only the stench of arrogance exposed. Charlotte remained frozen in her seat, her back straight, her fists clenched on her lap. She was silent now, but the fury radiating from her body was palpable. Her daughter's collapse in front of this audience was not just humiliation. It was the crumbling of everything Charlotte had built her life to preserve. Then Ethan moved. He didn't shout, didn't grandstand. He simply turned, his steps echoing as he walked down the aisle. Every click of his shoes against the marble was steady, deliberate, final. Madison reached out, her voice breaking. "Ethan, don't leave me here. Please, I can't face them alone." But he didn't stop. He didn't even look back. His silence cut sharper than any words could. Madison's sobs grew frantic, echoing through the vaulted ceiling. She sank to her knees, clutching at the fabric of her gown, as if by sheer will she could stop him from disappearing. But Ethan kept walking until his figure reached the great doors at the end of the hall. The officiant lowered his book, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. The string quartet, frozen mid-note, exchanged nervous glances, their bows hovering uselessly in the air. The wedding was over, but no one dared to declare it aloud. The silence that followed Ethan's exit was unbearable. It settled over the hall like a suffocating blanket. 200 guests watched as Madison crumbled, her sobs filling the vacuum he left behind. No one moved to comfort her. No one offered a hand. They simply watched, their silence becoming the cruelest verdict of all. One of the younger guests whispered harshly, "So much for important people." The words slashed through the silence, and though spoken softly, they reached Madison's ears. Her head snapped up, eyes red, hair wild, and for a fleeting second, rage replaced despair. But it was fleeting. Her strength dissolved as quickly as it came, and she collapsed again, her hands covering her face. I remained still, my hands folded in front of me. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. This wasn't triumph. It was truth unveiled in the harshest light possible. The room itself had become a witness, a jury of 200 souls delivering their silent sentence. 200 guests watched in silence. The line etched itself into my mind as I stood there, absorbing every second. It wasn't just a phrase, it was reality, living and breathing in that suffocating hall. Charlotte finally rose, her voice sharp as glass. "Enough!" she snapped, her command slicing through the stillness. But no one obeyed. The guests didn't rise. They didn't applaud. They didn't even shift in their seats. They remained still, eyes fixed on the wreckage of a family that had paraded their superiority, only to implode in public. Charlotte's words faltered. For the first time that evening, her authority meant nothing. The guests had already cast their judgment. Ethan was gone. Madison was broken, and the Blake name, once cloaked in untouchable prestige, was left tattered on the marble floor. I exhaled slowly, the weight of years lifting from my chest. This was never about destroying them. It was about letting the truth stand, unflinching, undeniable. The silence of those 200 guests was the proof. What Madison and Charlotte had tried to bury beneath arrogance was now laid bare for all to see. Their dream wedding had become their public undoing. And as the hush pressed deeper into the room, I knew every guest would leave carrying the same memory burned into their minds. Not vows, not celebration, but the moment silence itself became judgment. Madison's cries pierced the air like shattered glass. Her once perfect image, sculpted for this day, lay in ruins across the marble floor. She clutched at her gown, sobbing into the lace, the sound raw, guttural, nothing like the poised woman who had told me, "You don't belong." Charlotte sat frozen beside her, her face carved into stone. She said nothing. Not a defense, not an explanation, only silence. Her lips pressed tight, her eyes burning with a fury that could no longer disguise her defeat. For all her years of wielding power, of commanding rooms with a glance, Charlotte Blake was reduced to stillness. The guests, who had filled the hall with nervous whispers just moments before, now sat in heavy silence, as though afraid to move. Some had left already. Others stayed, transfixed by the spectacle unraveling before them. A wedding turned autopsy. A celebration turned funeral. Ethan stepped forward. His shoes echoed against the marble, steady but unsteady at once, the sound of a man breaking free from chains he had only just realized were binding him. He stopped beside me, his breath shaky. His hand reached for mine, then faltered, but I opened my palm and let him take it. When his fingers closed around mine, I felt the tremor in him, the conflict still tearing at his chest. But then he whispered, his voice breaking but clear enough for me and every guest near us to hear. I should have listened sooner. My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. I simply squeezed his hand, firm, unshakable, letting him know that no matter the years of silence, no matter the betrayal he had once been blind to, he was still my son. I didn't need to say, "I forgive you." My grip was enough. Madison lifted her head at his words, her face streaked with ruined makeup, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Ethan, no," she choked, crawling toward him, desperation clawing through every movement. "Don't do this. You love me. You promised me forever." Ethan didn't look at her. He stood taller, straighter, and pulled me close. In that moment, the hall knew he had chosen. The silence deepened, pressing down on every guest. It wasn't the hush of reverence. It was the weight of judgment, a room of 200 people watching a dynasty unravel. Charlotte finally spoke, her voice low, dangerous. "Ethan, think carefully. You walk away now, and you destroy everything. Your future, your status, your place in this world." He turned to her, his face pale but resolute. "No, Mother. You destroyed it yourself, with lies, with greed, with control." He paused, his voice cracking as his eyes met mine. "I won't sacrifice my soul for your legacy." Charlotte recoiled as though struck. For years she had sculpted him into the perfect heir, polished him to fit into the mold she believed unshakable. And in one breath, he shattered it. Madison let out another scream, collapsing fully to the ground, her hands clawing at the hem of Ethan's suit jacket. "Don't leave me, please! I can fix this! We can still—" He shook his head, tears brimming but his voice unflinching. "There's nothing left to fix." The officiant, who had been standing awkwardly with his book, lowered it to his side. The ceremony was over, though no vows had been spoken, no pronouncements made. The wedding was dead before it had begun. I looked around at the hall. The chandeliers still sparkled, the flowers still perfumed the air, the string quartet still clutched their instruments. Yet everything was wrong. The grandeur only highlighted the ruin. It was not a wedding. It was a wake. Guests began to rise one by one, not with applause, not with celebration, but with a heaviness that spoke louder than words. Some shook their heads, some whispered bitterly. One man muttered, "The Blakes are finished." Another replied, "They did it to themselves." Charlotte remained still, her fury contained behind trembling hands. She did not cry, she did not beg, but her silence was louder than Madison's screams. For the first time, the matriarch had no weapon left to wield. I drew Ethan closer, my hand firm on his shoulder. "Stand tall," I whispered, so only he could hear. "You're free now." He nodded, his eyes glistening. The scene was unbearable, yet unforgettable. 200 guests bore witness to the collapse of everything Charlotte and Madison had tried to build. The Carter name, once sneered at as new money, now stood unbroken, while the Blake name, ancient and arrogant, crumbled in real time. A wedding day had turned into a funeral, not of love, but of pride, greed, and false legacy. And as Madison's sobs echoed against the high ceiling, I knew none of us would ever forget it. 1 week later, the echoes of that ruined wedding still lingered across Manhattan society like smoke after a fire. My phone rang less. Meetings were canceled. One contract in particular, a deal I had worked on for months with a luxury developer, slipped through my fingers overnight. They didn't say it directly, but the message was clear. I had been too visible in the Blake scandal, too bold, too unflinching. Some people admired it, others feared it, and in business, fear often outweighed respect. I sat in my office at Carter Interiors, the skyline of New York stretching out like a reminder of everything I had built. The papers on my desk blurred as I thought about the deal that was gone. A loss, yes, but not a defeat. I whispered to myself, steady and calm. Justice always costs something. The tabloids had feasted for days. The wedding that never was. Blake heiress exposed. 200 guests watch dynasty collapse. Every headline carved deeper into Madison's humiliation. Charlotte's name, once synonymous with elegance and control, became a punchline whispered at cocktail parties. And then, silence. Madison vanished. No more lunches on Fifth Avenue, no more carefully staged photographs in society magazines. She retreated from the world that once bowed to her, her number disconnected, her friends scattering like leaves in the wind. Charlotte moved to Florida. A smaller house, far from the halls of power she once commanded. Rumor said she still dressed for dinner, pearls around her neck, refusing to admit defeat, even as the oceans swallowed her empire of influence. For them, it was exile. For me, it was consequence. But not all consequences were theirs. The business loss stung, and for a few days I felt the weight of it heavy on my chest. Yet in the quiet that followed, a sound reached me I hadn't heard in years. The sound of my son's footsteps coming through my own front door. Ethan moved back into the house he had once fled to chase a life shaped by others. The first night he stood in the doorway of the kitchen, sheepish, carrying a box of his things. "If you'll have me," he said softly. I didn't answer right away. I simply pulled out a chair, set a plate, and nodded. That was enough. We didn't need grand speeches. The silence that had once divided us now became the language of reconciliation. At dinner, he finally spoke. I thought I knew what I wanted, status, security, but I didn't realize the cost until it was too late. I placed my hand over his, calm but firm. It's never too late, Ethan. The only thing too late is refusing to see the truth when it stands before you. His eyes filled, but he didn't look away. Thank you for not giving up on me. That night, as I listened to the old creak of the floorboards above, I felt a strange peace. My company might have taken a blow. My reputation among certain circles might have dimmed. But my son was home. The child I had raised not as a merger, not as an heir, but as a man with a heart still capable of change. Justice had been served in that hall with 200 silent witnesses, but justice never arrives free of charge. It demands sacrifice. It strips away illusions, leaving scars. Yet those scars remind us of what we stood for when the world wanted us to bow. As I stood by my window, the city lights glittering below, I whispered the truth to myself once more. Justice has a price, and I have paid it. But I am not broken. I knew the Blakes would lick their wounds, perhaps try to rebuild in shadows, but their legacy had cracked. And my legacy, though quieter, was intact. Not in the headlines, not in contracts, but in the son who had finally come home. That was enough. I sat on the porch that evening, the hum of the crickets weaving into the quiet air. The city was far behind us now, its sharp lights and sharper tongues replaced with the golden calm of twilight. Beside me, Ethan was eating dinner at the small wooden table I had kept all these years. The meal was simple, roast chicken, green beans, bread warm from the oven. Nothing fancy, nothing staged, just food shared between mother and son. I watched him. For the first time in years, his shoulders were no longer pulled tight with expectation. His brow wasn't furrowed with the weight of someone else's dream. He looked younger, lighter, though the storm we had just survived was still visible in his eyes. He caught me staring and smiled faintly. "What?" he asked. I shook my head, my lips curving. "Nothing. Just, this is what I wanted. Not the contracts, not the titles, just this." He set down his fork, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "I almost lost this. I almost lost you." I reached across the table, my hand resting on his. "But you didn't. That's what matters." The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was whole, filling the air with something words didn't need to explain. I leaned back, eyes drifting toward the fading horizon, and finally said aloud the truth that had lived in me since that wedding day. Justice costs something, but if it gives me back my son, it's worth it. He lowered his head, his eyes glistening. "I'm sorry it took so long for me to see it." I squeezed his hand firmly. "Life always takes longer than we think. The point is, you saw." The porch creaked as the evening wind swept through, carrying away the last traces of bitterness that had clung to my home. For years, people like Charlotte had told me that worth was measured in wealth, in family names, in legacies carved into marble. But sitting there, with Ethan safe and present, I knew their version of legacy was hollow. The true legacy was this: the bond between a mother and her child. The truth spoken when lies tried to bury it. The quiet strength to face humiliation and still rise taller than those who tried to break you. That night, as Ethan cleared the plates and laughter broke through the walls that had once divided us, I realized something else. The world will always worship power, status, money. But none of that is worth the cost of losing family. No position in society, no promise of influence can ever be worth the silence of an empty chair at your table. 200 guests had watched a family collapse in silence. And now, in this house, in this moment, I understood the final lesson. Silence can destroy, but it can also heal. I turned to Ethan, my voice steady but warm. "Remember this, no matter what the world tells you, no matter what temptations come dressed as promises of greatness, never trade people for power. Never." He nodded, his voice sure. "Never again." I smiled, the kind of smile that comes only after fire has burned through everything false, the kind that tells you what remains cannot be shaken. And as the stars broke through the night sky, I felt peace, not the fragile peace of pretending all is well, but the fierce peace of knowing truth had prevailed, that love had survived, that justice, however costly, had given me back what mattered most. No one in that hall would ever forget the day the Blakes fell, but I would remember it for something else entirely, the day my son came home. Because in the end, no throne, no fortune, no reputation can outweigh this truth. There is no power greater than family, bound by love.